So we'll come back.
Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Angus.
Thank you. I'm so pleased you're here. I only have 7 minutes, so I'm not going to sound rude, but I'm going to have to get a few more questions in, so we'll be moving along. I mean, I think the development of the waterfront is crucial for Toronto, and I see what's happening in New York and Brooklyn for creating innovative public spaces is really important. But what we were told in that RFP was 12 acres, and now we learned from the Toronto Star that it's for the whole waterfront. Why was that not made clear in the RFP?
I think, as I just mentioned, the RFP actually says to think about Quayside and to think about solutions at scale. So transit at scale, district systems at scale, innovative financing options at scale, and that the designated waterfront area was actually, in fact, the area in which Waterfront Toronto has its purview. So,
had the first map was the 12-acre for the Quayside, but then when you did the plan development agreement, it was for the whole designated waterfront area. Isn't that rather unusual when we're talking about probably the most valuable real estate in North America? That here's the deal, it's only 12 acres, but then once we're moving down the road, it's actually the whole thing. I mean, people who bid on that were thinking it was only 12 acres. So was that an understanding from the get-go that you allowed another map in that was the whole waterfront?
I can't be certain, but the RFP, I think, does have a map of the entire waterfront, and that is the designated waterfront area that's in the plan development agreement is the geographic area that applies to Waterfront Toronto.
The RFP was said very clearly, the RFP is for Quayside development, and yet when it came out with the last summer, the agreement included the full map. So that's the question. So if this is a rigorous process, it was only a 6-week RFP, 10 weeks to do public art installations on the waterfront. The Auditor General has said that Sidewalk Labs received more information from Waterfront Toronto prior to the RFP. They raised questions that the board was not given much time to actually review this. So you tell us it's a rigorous process, but the Auditor General found that this thing was really pushed through quickly.
Okay, so I feel like there were sort of maybe 3 or 4 points in there, and I'd like to try and manage each one of them separately.
RFP.
Sorry?
I was just helping you.
Is that the
6 weeks.
first one
Yeah,
you'd
yeah.
like me? Okay. Yeah. So the RFP was actually 159 days. I think I mentioned that already. And in fact, it's the second longest RFP that we've ever run at Waterfront Toronto. It is a 2-staged RFP process, and none of the bidders in the first part or in the second part asked for any extensions. We often give extensions if people are asking. We sought guidance from our external legal, from our procurement advisors, and from our own experience. And 159 days we think was sufficient.
59 days.
That's correct.
What we've been told is 6 weeks. So
that's not correct. in
okay,
fact.
so that's good to know. Now, the Investment and Real Estate Committee did not recommend this project. But then it was passed to the board, who was only given 1 business day to approve on October 13th. But then we're told that the day before they'd already had the announcement ready that the Prime Minister, the Premier, the Mayor, and Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk Labs was signing the deal. So if the Real Estate Committee did not recommend this project, if you have rigorous oversight, why was this flagged ahead?
So what I will say is that the IREC, which is our Investment and Real Estate Committee, it's kind of like saying that a third reading of a bill is rushed when committee has had it for weeks and has reviewed every clause, every comma, and has been helping the team negotiate. So IREC, in fact, had at least 6 meetings prior to the board meeting where the board voted with only 1 dissenting vote, I might add.
Did not recommend it.
IREC did not recommend it. The board but IREC doesn't approve. They take things forward to the board, and the board determined that it would vote on the document because the rigorous analysis had been done. IREC had reviewed all of the document and had, given guidance to the negotiating team, the staff, all the way through the process. And in fact, they had been part of the RFP process all the way through the IREC committee.
They're the review committee. And now we learn from the Toronto Star, and they talk about how if this moves forward, it will move a large recurring revenue stream being diverted from the city into private hands, which was not in the original RFP. You're saying you're talking about economies of scale. But the Real Estate Committee said no to this, and so it went ahead anyways. The Auditor General said that Sidewalk Labs was giving more information than their competing bids. The Auditor General says that they were given just a weekend to discuss and understand the implications of the initial framework agreement before being asked to approve it. So my question is, was the Auditor General wrong? Was she reading something else?
No, I would say that the experience that we have had at Waterfront Toronto was that the due diligence was done at the committee level. The board was briefed, and all the way along through the process. They also did get 2 briefings on the framework agreement. The other thing to mention about the framework agreement, and if there was something I'd like to learn from this process, is that the agreement we have today with Sidewalk is the one we should have started with. We probably should have done a different agreement right at the beginning. That agreement was just to get us to do the next agreement, which was the PDA. So it had no handcuffs for our board or for governments. It didn't require us to stay in the deal. We could walk away at any time.
The Auditor General found internal Waterfront Toronto emails that, quote, the board felt it was being urged strongly by the federal and provincial governments to approve and authorize the framework agreement with Sidewalk Labs as soon as possible. So if they were under pressure to approve this deal, your real estate committee was saying no. The Auditor General was feeling that there was a number of other questions. How was that framework agreement handled with absolute vigor and rigorous review if the board felt it was being pushed into making this decision?
So 2 things I want to say about that. One is the board did vote. There was only 1 dissenting vote. So the board was actually fine with the agreement. And there's a first point that you mentioned.
IRAC actually didn't say no, they just deferred it to the board.
Oh, they deferred it to the board. No, I'm sorry. I'll come back to it. There was another point that you made there that I wanted to respond to. No, sorry. I mentioned the board. The board did have briefings, and they did vote with only 1 dissenting opinion or a dissenting vote. So they were actually fine with the agreement.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Angus. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Saini.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to defer